Okay, guys, this is the part two of the 5.4 standard that we've been working on. We're going to pick up where we left off the other day, and this is going to start with how the government is going to take action during World War One. And pretty much they're going to take action through something known as the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Both of those things were things that involved prohibiting people from really sort of speaking out against the government, interfering with military operations, any show of support for the enemies that the United States was having to fight during World War One. And again, no negative speech about the government at all. If you did that, you could go directly to jail, like you see on the bottom of the slide here. And again, you see some other posters that were from this period. You can take a look at those. It gives you an idea about how serious this was at this point. And of course, the United States wanted to make sure that they had the full support of the public and didn't want to take the risk of things getting being put into a negative light. Another one too on here, interfering with the sale of government bonds. Of course, bonds were huge during World War One. People had to sell those bonds, and the government had to sell those bonds in order to make some money and try to get money to use during the war effort. Of course, as the war comes closer to an end, Woodrow Wilson has drafted a plan for peace. His plan for peace is known as the 14 Points. Um, Again, this is when Wilson sort of refers to World War One as the war to end all wars. Wilson's goal for lasting peace in the 14 points included a lot of the things that directly relate to the causes. Of course, freedom of the seas. Remember that unrestricted submarine warfare is what brought the United States into the war. Into secret treaties. Remember, alliances were a big reason why this war gets started. Arms reduction, decreasing the amount of weapons that a country has. Remember, militarism was part of those causes of the war. Self-determination, allowing countries to pick their own form of government. Of course, Wilson's pushing for democracy. Remember that imperialism had been the main tool that eventually caused some of these countries to go to war with each other. And of course, self-determination is going against the idea of imperialism, that you shouldn't have imperialist powers. And then the last one that we have listed here was an international peace organization, which would be the League of Nations, where countries could come together and try to settle any disputes before they led to conflict. So the 14 points was Wilson's plan for lasting peace. As the war draws to an end, both sides decide to sign what we call an armistice. And an armistice is an agreement to stop fighting altogether. The armistice for World War I was signed on November the 11th, 1918. Again, this is when, if you've seen the book or seen the movie, a movie called All Quiet on the Western Front was detailing this whole event and how the war slowly comes to an end. The treaty that would end the war, of course, is the Treaty of Versailles, and it would be signed later after the armistice. It wouldn't be signed until 1919. And that pretty much ends World War One. Now we're going to look at some of the things that occur after World War One. Of course, Treaty of Versailles we just talked about. It ends the war in 1919. Officially, it was negotiated, signed 1919 by the European Allies. The only problem with the Treaty of Versailles is that the United States never ratified it, never approved of it. But what the Treaty of Versailles called for was to put all the blame on Germany. There's a part of the Treaty of Versailles known as the War Guilt Clause, which was put into the Treaty of Versailles to make sure that Germany took the full blame. Germany is going to be forced to pay reparations. Reparations are payments that Germany had to make because they took full responsibility for the war. Those payments were in excess of $33 billion. One thing, too, that occurs is these empires that had been created before World War I are slowly going to be broken apart. One such example was the Ottoman Empire completely comes to an end, and all of those places that were part of the Ottoman Empire break apart and become their own new countries. Again, self-determination, the right to be able to pick your own form of government, have self-rule, was a big focus of the Treaty of Versailles. Again, one of the things that Woodrow Wilson pushed for as well. League of Nations, of course, peacekeeping organization that was organized. The United States never officially joined, but its intent was for a good cause. But unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't actually get involved. The League of Nations would try to settle conflicts before they led to military action. Continuing on with the Treaty of Versailles, of course, like I said earlier, the United States Senate did not approve or ratify the treaty. Part of the reason was because they were afraid that we would get involved in another war or be involved in foreign conflicts. And like we've said many times, is that the United States returned to isolationism. Again, the United States had a fear of collective security, which pretty much means we wanted to worry about ourselves and then not anybody else. We would have to fight if the League of Nations got into a war. So therefore, the Senate is not willing to pass the Treaty of Versailles. I think it loses by 7 votes. And that pretty much puts an end to the United States ever officially ending World War I. Anyway, the 1920 election comes about. Woodrow Wilson is on the way out. Unfortunately for Woodrow Wilson, he is in bad health. The next president would be Warren G. Harding. He would win the election of 1920. The Senate was mainly dominated by Republicans. And of course, the Republicans didn't confirm the Treaty of Versailles. And part of that, too, was also because of politics, sort of like the same way we're dealing with some things today. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. The Senate was mainly Republican. Of course, the two political parties battling back and forth didn't confirm the Treaty of Versailles as well because of Wilson being a Democrat. 1920, Warren G. Harding wins. His slogan or theme was return to normalcy. And we've discussed this. This is a disillusionment of having your bubble burst. He did not believe that the United States need to be entangled in these foreign affairs and foreign conflicts. So he wanted to return to the way things were before the war, the United States sort of keeping to themselves and not worrying about what was going on, especially in Europe and other parts of the world. He said that the United States now understood brutality of war, the human cost, and the greed that was associated with it, and that we did not need to play a role or have a part in those types of things. We began to reject the idea of interventionism. Of course, when we talked about that period with the dollar diplomacy and moral diplomacy and big stick diplomacy, all of those were interventionist policies. But those interventionist policies are now gone, and the United States is moving away from being an interventionist and moving away from the idea of imperialism. Again, the United States would return back to isolationism, keeping to themselves. Some post-war practices. Again, we became a leading exporter. Of course, all these countries in Europe had been destroyed, mainly due to the war. And of course, the United States was glad to pick up the cause and start shipping things to those places in Europe. We also began to practice something called the good neighbor policy. We had been a bad neighbor during the period from 1900 to 1914, often intervening in Latin America. Now we want to try to improve those relations with Latin America by using this good neighbor policy. And you can see this poster here on the right-hand side depicting that. Again, we didn't join the League of Nations, but we did attend the meetings, even though we weren't officially part of the League of Nations, to make sure that things were going in a positive way. And like we said earlier, the United States has taken a hands-off approach in Europe, And by taking that hands-off approach, that's going to allow the buildup of three of the most notorious dictators that the world had ever seen: Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Benito Mussolini would rise to power during this period after World War I. And that's going to do it for 5.4. We will pick up, well, that's 5.4 and 5.5. So we have finished both indicators, and we will pick up with standard 6 coming soon.